Here we go. He enters a synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they're watching Yeshua to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might do what? Accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And then he turns and he says to the crowd, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But shut my mouth. Nobody said a word. Their eyes are just bugging out, and they're thinking about what he just said, and now they're mad. He looks around them with anger and grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And then the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how they were going to destroy Yeshua. They want to kill him. All right, now let's think about this for a minute. Why did they get so worked up over a miracle of healing somebody? Why do you think it's over? He just healed the guy. Why take it so personal? Maybe it isn't over what he did, but what he said. The man with the withered hand, remember, did not come and ask to be healed. He's just standing there. Yeshua told him, he said, "Come here." It's interesting that the word accuse, where he says they were looking for a reason to accuse him, the Greek word is where we get our word from, category. They were trying to categorize him. They're trying to put Yeshua in a box, label him, all right? Yeshua accepts the challenge. And so he says to the man with the withered hand, "Okay, come here." Here's what Yeshua's thinking. He's thinking that with the man's help, he's going to turn this into a teaching opportunity. Isn't that what is supposed to happen in the synagogue every Sabbath? A teaching opportunity about Moses? And they're the ones who brought up Moses. So he says to the Pharisees, "Okay, you want to play Moses? We're going to do a skit here. We're going to act out in a skit." And he says, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or to kill?" So he now does to them what they thought actually to do to him. He's putting them on the spot. Here's why. They're talking law, right? They know the law. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 26 through 28. It says, "Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse." The blessing comes if what? If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you to this day. But the curse comes if you don't obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I command you to go after other gods. Now, let's look at what Moses himself said. Let's look at Moses' own words in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15 through 18. And all of this happened the same day within an hour. Even though it's chapter 11 and chapter 30, it's all one speech that Moses gives. And Moses says this, "See, I've set before you this day life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you, by loving the Lord your God and walking in his ways and keeping his commandments and his statutes and his ordinances, you'll live and multiply, and the Lord your God will do what?" That big hand that stretched forth is either going to bless you, but if your heart turns away and you don't hear and are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you this day, you will perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're going over the Jordan to enter and possess. So here we go. Here we are. Okay, what do you want? Life or death? I said, before you a choice. What do you want? You want life or death? Who wants life? Who wants death? Boo. Okay. So let me explain. Yeshua is doing what should be happening on every Sabbath. He's reenacting Moses for them. It's as though, here's what he's saying. Okay, guys, so Moses' law prohibits certain things on the Sabbath. But here we are, today, we're celebrating the Sabbath, all right? And here we have someone with a withered hand. Well, I'm putting before you a choice in exactly the same way Moses did, because any attempt to reenact Moses is always going to put before you a choice, good or bad, life or death. And obeying means pursuing life and good. And disobeying means pursuing death and evil. So are you really celebrating the Sabbath according to Moses, he's asking them? Do you want this guy to have life come and his hand healed? Or do you want to keep him in bondage like Pharaoh did? If you are, you will certainly want me to choose life and good. And if you're not, then who are you to accuse me of disobeying the law of Moses? Well, as you can imagine, this is a very annoying question. Those gathered were not really expecting to have Moses reenacted by this radical new interpretation, one that went right back to the roots in their very midst. One of the things you really can't do when you're faced with a choice is to say, okay, I'm going to obey the commandments, which means not choosing life, but choosing evil. Well, guess what? When he says that, they get it. And they know exactly what he's saying. That's why they're paralyzed. How can they say we're keeping the commandments and we're choosing bondage? Okay. For them, Moses was someone who they were trying to manipulate and use against Yeshua. We're going to use Moses as a tool. Rather than really understanding the whole concept, they're using him as a tool against Yeshua. But now he's offered them the real Moses. He says, no, you don't know the real Moses. I'm going to tell you the real Moses. Insinuating that the real Moses is against their Moses in a way that's perfectly clear to them. And so he looks around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart. Who had a hard heart? Pharaoh. Okay, so here he's bringing the whole Exodus story that we've just read in their ears. And guess what? They are now the Pharaoh. The Pharisees are the Pharaoh in this story. And he's saying, just like Pharaoh hardened his heart, you're a Pharaoh. You're hardening your heart against this man and don't want him healed. You want to keep him in bondage. Well, here we have a splendid example of a Moses for Dummies guide. Okay, it's a giveaway. That little phrase, hardness of heart. To anyone who even slightly is acquainted with the Hebrew scriptures, there's one person above all others who suffers from hardness of heart, and that's the Pharaoh of Egypt. So God tells Pharaoh through Moses, let my people go. And every time that Pharaoh is about to do that, he hardens his heart. Instead of mercy, he keeps the people back in bondage. And here, Yeshua is looking at them saying, are you going to let my people go? Are you going to allow him to become out of bondage and to be healed? So Yeshua just got done correctly interpreting Moses to them, and he's even gone one step further. Now Yeshua is playing the role of the Yud-He-Vav-He, looking at the hard Pharaoh, who will not let his people go. And the man with the withered arm has become a stand-in for the people of Israel in bondage to Egypt. And so he says to the man, just like the Yud-He-Vav-He said, stretch forth your hand. And so what happens? See, he's playing this whole Red Sea, everything, all the plagues. And so he stretches forth his hand and it was restored. Well, this really rubs it in. First, they try to trap Yeshua with the Moses trap. He says, okay, you want Moses? I'll give you the real Moses. And I'm going to play the Yud-He-Vav-He. This guy with the withered hand represents Israel in bondage to the Egyptians, and you are the Egyptians. You're Pharaoh, holding him in bondage. Okay, remember on several occasions during the buildup to the Exodus, Yahweh says to Moses to stretch out his hand, or he tells Moses to stretch out your hand. Either if God stretches out his hand or Moses stretches out his hand. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 4, 32 through 35. It says, ask now of the days that are past, which are before you, since the day that God created man on the earth. Ask from one end of heaven to the other whether such a great thing has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself in the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war? By a mighty hand and a stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? It says, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God, there's no other besides him. When Yeshua said, stretch out your hand, he's saying, I am the Lord your God, and there isn't another beside me. He did the miracle. See, when he said, he's saying, look, he's Israel, you're Pharaoh, and I am the Lord your God, and I say, stretch out your hand, and a miracle happens. This is absolutely incredible. Just like, I mean, these verses I gave you are just as central to Jewish theology as the Sermon on the Mount is to Christians. They knew all these stories. They knew to stretch forth your hand. They understood the plagues. They understood the hardness of heart. Okay? He's saying you are acting like the Pharaoh of Egypt by using Moses' law for exactly the opposite of what Moses intended it to be done. Moses himself was the person who led the people out of Egypt, right? Well, what is it that Yahweh did? Isn't that what he did? But now get a load of this. Here's the kicker. Here is the absolute kicker. They wanted to see if he was going to heal on the Sabbath, right? Well, guess what? The Israelites left on the first day of unleavened bread, which is the Sabbath. So even God himself worked on the Sabbath and stretched forth his hand and freed them from bondage. See, this is the point. They're thinking, are you going to heal on the Sabbath? And it's like, well, God himself healed on the Sabbath. My gosh, he stretched forth his hand and parted the waters on the Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread. Moses, he stretched forth his hand and made it part. They both stretched forth their hand. Miracle took place. They're living. They're not dead by Pharaoh. And now you're telling me because I heal a guy with a withered hand, I'm breaking the law of Moses? He's saying, you don't know Moses. I know Moses. Here's the thing. What Yeshua's done is not just made someone better on Shabbat, but he's thrown into the midst of his listener a bombshell, asking them what story of themselves are they thinking that they're the good guys? How might that story be turned around so that it challenges us to the point it produces us the same anger that they had? In other words, when all of a sudden you start teaching the Hebrew roots and people who don't understand the Hebrew roots have one image of Jesus, and then all of a sudden it gets turned around because, his name's Yeshua, will that produce all kinds of anger in us when all of a sudden our theology changes? Or will that produce anger in others? All too often, when all of a sudden our preconceived notions of Moses, our preconceived notions of Yeshua get challenged, are we going to be as angry as the Pharisees against people who challenge the paradigm? God had to make a point to Pharaoh more than just freeing Israel. Yeshua wants to make the point to the Pharisees more than just healing a hand. And he wants us to realize as people's paradigm shift changes and then all of a sudden they realize, oh my gosh, he's Jewish. I think there'll be people who are looking for the Lord when he comes, they're going to be mad at him because they put him in a box. He's not the one that's coming back. They tried to accuse him as the same word in the Greek where we get the word they tried to categorize him. And so my word to you is we need to have oftentimes a paradigm shift, but we also need to realize sometimes we get angry when we realized things have changed. And we have to have understanding in other people when they get mad because you're changing their paradigm. So that's why we need to pray for one another. Amen?